She said, okay. I remember when I got in ministry, I told God, I'm never getting out. And just when I started investing, I said, I'll invest to the day that I go to be with the Lord. And I'm just a very committed person. I'm big on consistency, okay? And I don't let trials and storms and tribulations get me off the path, okay? Philippians 4:6. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be known to God, okay? So when God gives you something to connect to be faithful to, you stay connected to it for a long period of time. I remember years ago, there was a gentleman, phenomenal business guy, and the Lord at a young age called him into real estate. So he got into real estate, bought a lot of good properties, and eventually paid these properties off. And they were properties, some were residential, some was commercial, and people would pay him rent, but he'd have them all paid for. And then for some reason he thought he would sell them, and then he would get into another business, which he had a lot of money because they were paid for. And I remember I said, did God tell you to quit? He said, no, God called me into this, but I got them all paid off, so I'm going to sell them. And in the natural, it was great because he got millions of dollars. And I remember, he's still okay because he had so much money. But I remember he told me, he said, after I sold them, I look back over the last 5 years, and, I'd had a lot of money, and I'm reinvesting some of it, so I'm okay. But I've never been at that level I was when I sold them. Gradually, I'm just slowly going down, which I have enough money, I'm going to be okay. But I thought about me and my family is okay. But then I thought, what could I have given to missions? How many church planners could I really have helped? What could I have done for our local church's youth group? How many widows and orphans could I have helped? But because for years, I had a mortgage on a lot of my properties, when I paid them off, I sold them all. But long-term thinking kingdom, I could have sowed so much money into the kingdom. I could have blessed so many people, but I almost took like an easy way out, and no other business that I ever got into worked. I said, so what are you going to do? He said, get back into real estate. And I said, good choice. And so when it says be anxious for nothing, don't worry about things. When good opportunities come, don't be anxious. When you're going through a trial, don't be anxious. Understand longevity. Understand long term. And if you're in a place in your life and you're like, I need to make up some time, I'm going to tell you a few stories that's going to help you. One of the most powerful stories that I really relate with was by Kobe Bryant. And they were talking about, and I just heard this probably story about like a year ago, but it's the same thing I did when I was young in a lot of different things. I remember that they interviewed him, and when he got into the NBA, he was, they talked about that every team has a team practice. And then he talked to some average players, not below average, but average NBA players, and they said, yeah, I practice an hour before team practice, and the good players would say, I practice an hour before, and maybe I may go home and eat or something, but then I have another practice. But he said, but I want to be a great player. So if good players practice 3 times a day, I'll practice 4 times a day. He went to the league very early. And so basically he said, by the time I'm at 30, I've already been practicing 4 times a day. I had more hours of practice than anybody in the NBA probably, so no one could catch me. I remember when I was young, I was in rodeo, I was a team roper. When I was probably 10, 11 years old, I walked up to the people that I knew in our geographical location that people would consider one of the best, and I would say, how many steers do you rope a day? And so they told me, so I went home and told my dad, I need to double it. And so I doubled what they were doing. And I remember in school when we were younger, I played basketball like in junior high. It was the 8th grade year. I remember I wasn't the best player. I wasn't the tallest player. I'm 6'4" now. I was not in junior high. I wasn't even in, if you got the team and you look at the half that was the tallest, I probably wasn't even the top half. But I remember I started working on my free throws, and I asked the guy that I thought was the best shooter on the team, how many free throws do you shoot a day when you go home? He said, man, after school, I go home and shoot 50 free throws a day. So I started shooting 100 a day. And I remember in the 8th grade, our coach would keep stats. My free throw percentage was 88%, which was pretty good for an 8th grader. But I remember I found whoever I thought was the best, and I just started duplicating it. I remember when I was in church, now this is not a competition, but I found who I thought the most spiritual woman was, and the most spiritual man. I asked the most spiritual woman, I said, how many times a day do you come to the church and pray? Because people would come to the church and pray. She said, well, I come and pray an hour a day at the church. So I said, well, I want to be spiritual, and I want to make up time in my life. I was 20 years old, so I started praying 2 hours a day. And I asked this one gentleman, how much do you pray a day? He said, I pray 2 hours a day. And he said, but Joe, I started late in life. You're young. And so I said, I want to be somebody of prayer. So whenever somebody would set what they do in life, and I had long-term vision, I had longevity, I would double what somebody else was doing to speed up my time. Okay, earlier this week, in the scripture, it talks about multiplication. I remember one time I went to my wife and I said, I was looking at how much we put in investments, and with compound interest and how money works, it would take us X amount of years to get to a certain level. She's like, no, that ain't gonna work. I said, we need to double up what we do. She said, we can't afford it. And I remember I said, you know what I'll do? I'll get a part-time job just to invest. Did you know at one point I created a small business, which we still have, a small business that I've never taken a salary from. It goes straight into investments. And those investments, I'll probably never use them, but they'll be used for other purposes. A lot of times if you get a big long-term vision, you find out who's really doing something good in that area, and you duplicate it. You do more than them. That's how you get ahead in anything. My dad told me this one time. He said, son, when I was younger, I was working at an Army depot, and they were doing a lot of layoffs. And so he said, I had a philosophy. If I outwork the person to the right and the person to the left, and they're going to lay off 2 out of 3 people, I'm not going to be one that they lay off, because I'm going to outwork everybody around me. I've just always kind of had that mindset. Why? Because longevity. Why is that important? Why are you talking about something like this? Because the more you do something, you buy into it. I know so many people who they'll go to the gym and they play in the gym and they won't stay committed, versus people who buy into health and fitness and how it reaches their long-term vision for life according to longevity and what God has for them. So many times in life, things shift. I remember we started in investing. I remember one day my wife was like, what if we, invest in later in life, we're able to fund missionaries, third world nations. Maybe the finances that we're raising are just not for ourselves. And that's why even if you're a partner in Joe Joe Dawson Ministries, a huge portion of what comes in turns around and goes out. That's why we always have new partners joining, because God honors us because of the amount that we turn around and give out. And I want you to think about your life, the gifts, talents, and abilities God's given you. Maybe you could sow some of your time. I remember so many times in my life, I'll just sow my gifts into people. There's been times I've gone and preached places and I give them back their honorarium. I said, look, I felt I was supposed to sow. Doing stuff like that brings longevity in ministry, longevity in life. Whenever you can never outgive God. When you take care of God's people, everything shifts. And so I just want you to understand that God is viewing your life long term. Okay, a lot of people just worry about here and now, right now. When you can grab a hold of God's vision for your life, for your whole life, everything is going to change. Everything will change. And when you live your life according to the Spirit of God, you're going to live a very long, happy, productive life. And that's what we're all called to do. And so I just want to encourage you today, if you don't feel just a phenomenal purpose for your life, tap back in, go back into the things that God has for you. I remember one time I was frustrated where I was spiritually, And I asked a mentor. He said, well, how much do you read a day? And I said, I don't know, probably the Bible 10 minutes and 10 minutes in a book, and I pray about an hour. He said, well, double it all. Okay. Started praying 2 hours a day. Reading the Bible 30 minutes. Reading the book for 30 minutes. And all of a sudden, I saw myself just start growing in God. And I caught a greater glimpse of what God had for me with longevity. Okay. It shifts everything. Get a long-term vision. Now, I'm going to give you some next level mentoring stuff right here. Okay. What is your vision for the next 7 days? What's your vision for the next 30 days, next 90 days, next 6 months, 12 months, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years? Write it down and start viewing. Whenever your time and your day gets hard, let's see, okay, if you're talking about the next 7 days, you're looking down. Next month, you look up a little bit. Next 3 months, you look up a little bit more. You got to keep looking up until you can regain your vision. Regain your vision. You know how people say in the winter, I got to start getting in shape because we're going to go to the beach this year, and they got a vision. Got to start saving money up. It's August. Christmas is coming. I need to put some extra money back. That's kind of a long-term natural vision that a lot of people get. But as God keeps promoting my wife and we're in a huge acceleration season, am I going to be in the right place when God wants to use me in a mighty way? I saw a gentleman the other day that's 14 years older than me. I have so much respect for this guy. And what he does with his life is very similar to what I do. And he was like, well, you got 14 years to be my age. If you want to do what I'm doing, what are you going to do to get there? And I'm like, it's a good point. I'm going to be where he's at. In fact, I'm going to be hopefully further along though. He's at a great place. But I don't see why I can't be further along. It's not a competition. I just love what he's doing. But I want to do so much for God in my life. I can't pay attention to the trials from here and now. I can't pay attention to things people are coming against me. I've got to be able to get my mindset fixed long term, and I got to blow past it. Okay? I got to move forward towards what God has. If I have a problem, I deal with it. Okay? If I have a situation, I deal with it. If I have a physical infirmity, I deal with it and I move on because long-term goal. And I move forward in advance. All right? I love you guys. And if you want prayer, if you want to know about the mentoring program or how to become a monthly partner, you can go to joejoedawson.net. In fact, all of the links are down below. And we sure love you guys, and we are in your corner.